Hello there! Today we will be talking about session management, and I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to the concept. Then I'm going to discuss the ways that web applications can manage the session ID lifecycle for each user securely. Next, I'm going to mention how to safely exchange these session ID tokens using cookies. Finally, I'm going to discuss ways of expiring the session securely. When this lesson is finished, you will be able to evaluate a system to determine if it follows the generally prescribed secure methods for session management. Let's dive right in.
Because HTTP is stateless, in order to create the notion of a state, we need to use some sort of mechanism to remember a previous request as being a portion of a much larger session. Many web applications use cookies as a way to create a session. The server generates some piece of data, then gives this data to the browser. On subsequent requests, the browser gives the piece of data back to the server, and the server uses this piece of data to identify that the particular browser is associated with a specific account on the web application. Note that every web application uses sessions. State management can also be achieved using HTTP authentication, for example. However, we will concentrate on this course on examining sessions using cookies, as this is the most common. So here is a representation of a very simple session management finite state machine with a clear start state, various session states, and an end state. As you can see, the state transitions are induced by the browser by sending RESTful requests to the server. What's missing in this very simple session management finite state machine is a transition from the logged in state to the logged out state, where the transition occurs due to an expired session. Note that you can set a cookie attribute and give it an expiry date so that this will provide a way to expire the session. Now, this finite state machine is very, very simple, and this is a way for us to be able to have a fundamental understanding of session management. Now, there are several things that you want to keep in mind when you are writing your web application, and specifically when you need to create a secure session lifecycle. What you want to do is to create strong tokens. What this means effectively is from the very beginning, make sure to create tokens. So these tokens are what you are giving to the web browser from the web server. Make sure to create these tokens that are difficult to guess. You want these session tokens to be as random as possible. We want to make sure that attackers can't brute force through session token values to guess any existing sessions. This is because if attackers are able to guess existing session tokens, they can take over the session associated to those session tokens. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is to make sure that the transportation of these session tokens from the web server to a browser is always using an encrypted channel. So HTTPS should be used between the browser and the server. Another thing that you want to make sure to do is to make sure these token data that you are giving to the web browser, they should never be used as part of a URL. This is because these are in the clear. They're stored in browser history. They're stored in log data. They can be used by unsuspecting users to send links to their friends. This means that if a token is out in the clear in a URL, that token must be deemed tainted. So with that said, another thing that you want to keep in mind with web applications are that the sessions that they use should be expired after some time that isn't too long. For example, 10 or 15 minutes. You also want to prevent logins from more than one place. This is because it makes session management easier to implement safely and reduces complexity. And also, you want to make sure that if a session token indeed is stolen by an attacker, if your web application happens to allow multiple logins from more than one place, your system won't be able to tell whether that is because an attacker has used a session token or it's because the user happens to be logged in more than once. So, preventing logins from more than one place removes that ambiguity. Another thing that you want to make sure to keep in mind is to have a look at your cookie scope. Both the cookie domain scope and path scope. You want to set cookie scope to be as restrictive as is possible. So remember that the name of the game is to keep session data for each user secret. Double check that your cookie scope is reduced as much as possible. The domain scope and the path scope of the cookie. Also make sure that the cookie is inaccessible via JavaScript and is only sent back to the server. So making sure that the cookie attribute of HTTP only is set. Remember that cookie domain scope can be such that if you specify a cookie scope and the cookie scope is set to the parent domain of the web application, any web applications in the subdomains of that parent domain will then be able to receive the cookie from the user's browser if the user happens to access it. For example, if you had foo.com as your cookie scope, and that is the parent domain of your web application, and your web application happens to live in webapp.foo.com, then testapp.foo.com will also be able to receive the cookies that you have set for webapp.foo.com if a user happens to browse to testapp.foo.com. Thinking about expiring these sessions, you want to make sure that your web application has a proper logout functionality and it's working as expected. You want to make sure that the session information on the server side is cleared out every time a logout occurs. And the server should invalidate that particular web browser's session token cookie. And any new logins should generate a completely new session token cookie. And that data generated for that cookie should be as random as possible. You could, in addition, implement a defensive session termination. What that means is you could implement your web application to be such that if the server receives invalid requests from a client, the server can force the client to perform a re-authentication. In summary, we talked about session management, and I showed you a very simple finite state machine for session management so that you have a fundamental understanding of what that functionality would look like. And then we talked about managing the lifecycle for a session and also talked about making sure to expire these sessions properly. That's it for now. Thanks for listening.